The ferry arrived through black fog just before the evening tide swallowed the docks beneath the island cliffs. Elias watched the monastery emerge slowly from the mist, like a corpse rising from black water after centuries underwater. Every passenger kept their eyes lowered, while enormous bells groaned somewhere high above the rocks. The old ferryman refused payment when Elias stepped onto the slippery wooden pier, completely alone that evening. He whispered that nobody should remain on the island after the first high tide reached the cliffs below. Before Elias could ask another question, the ferryman sailed away without ever looking back toward the monastery. Cold wind carried the smell of salt, mildew, and something rotten drifting from the shoreline surrounding the island. A narrow staircase climbed toward the monastery through jagged rocks covered with dead seabirds and black seaweed. Elias noticed many birds had their throats torn open with horrifying precision beside the stone path. Rain hammered the monastery walls as Elias reached the gates moments before sunset, disappeared behind the sea completely. Hooded monks waited silently beneath flickering lanterns that swayed violently against the rising storm outside the entrance. None of them smiled while escorting him through endless corridors lined with ancient religious paintings. Inside, the monastery felt older than anything Elias had ever filmed during his travels across abandoned locations and ruins. Water dripped constantly from the ceilings, despite massive fireplaces burning throughout the dark stone structure beneath the cliffs. Strange chanting echoed faintly somewhere deep below the monastery, before suddenly stopping without explanation. The abbot greeted Elias inside a candlelit chamber decorated with paintings of drowning monks and black ocean storms. His pale hands trembled slightly while pouring tea into cracked porcelain cups beside the dying fireplace flames. He welcomed Elias warmly, but warned him never to wander outside after high tide arrived each evening. Elias assumed the warning belonged to some strange religious tradition practiced by isolated communities, surviving far from civilization entirely. The abbot's expression darkened instantly when Elias laughed softly at the unusual rule concerning silence after sunset. He leaned closer and quietly explained that silence protected everyone living inside the monastery from something ancient. A massive bell suddenly rang outside, shaking dust loose from the ceiling beams and cracked walls surrounding the chamber. Every monk nearby lowered their heads immediately and stopped speaking without hesitation or visible confusion afterward. Elias felt deeply unsettled, watching terror spread silently across the exhausted faces surrounding him inside the hall. The monks hurried through corridors, extinguishing candles while locking heavy wooden doors throughout the monastery before complete darkness arrived. One young monk accidentally dropped a lantern and began trembling violently beside the staircase after the glass shattered everywhere. Another monk dragged him away before Elias could ask questions or offer assistance inside the corridor. Darkness consumed the monastery, moments after high tide crashed violently against cliffs below the island during the storm. Elias sat alone inside his assigned room while seawater pounded somewhere beneath the old wooden floorboards below him. He checked his recording equipment repeatedly just to calm the growing anxiety twisting inside his chest. Near midnight, faint whispering drifted slowly through the hallway outside his locked wooden door, somewhere beyond the darkness. Elias pressed his ear against the surface and heard dozens of voices murmuring together softly beneath the storm outside. None of the whispers sounded human, because every voice gurgled like drowning victims, speaking underwater from deep below. The whispering stopped suddenly when something scratched slowly across the opposite side of his door late that night. Elias froze completely after hearing wet footsteps retreat down the corridor toward the chapel beneath the monastery afterward. Then a distant scream echoed briefly outside before the entire island returned once again to horrifying silence. The monastery bells erupted before sunrise, dragging Elias awake from shallow sleep filled with drowning faces and black seawater nightmares. Grey light crept through the cracked window while water dripped steadily inside the walls surrounding his small room upstairs. For several moments, Elias questioned whether the whispers outside his door had happened at all. When he entered the corridor, every monk avoided looking directly into his eyes while passing silently beside him afterward. Their faces appeared pale and hollow, as though none of them had slept during the violent storm overnight. One elderly monk clutched prayer beads so tightly that blood stained his trembling fingertips inside the dining chamber. Breakfast was served in silence inside a freezing stone room overlooking the violent northern sea crashing below the cliffs. Nobody spoke while bowls of thin soup and black bread passed quietly between the exhausted monks surrounding Elias there. Even spoons scraping against dishes sounded disturbingly loud within. The tense atmosphere consuming the monastery during daylight, Elias attempted to lighten the mood by asking questions about the island's strange customs and frightening nightly rituals afterward. The monks immediately lowered their heads after hearing his voice echo across the chamber walls during breakfast that morning. The abbot quietly ordered Elias never to ask questions during meals again inside the monastery halls. Outside, thick fog swallowed most of the island before noon arrived completely across the rocky coastline beneath the cliffs. Elias wandered narrow paths lined with broken statues eroded by centuries of rain, storms, and crashing salt water from below. Nearly every statue had its mouth violently chipped away from the weathered stone faces permanently. Behind the chapel, Elias discovered a graveyard half buried beneath wet black sand and tangled weeds beside the cliffs. Ancient wooden crosses leaned crookedly toward the sea like rotting fingers reaching upward from beneath the earth itself below. Many graves carried no names because their markings had been deliberately scratched away years earlier by someone unknown. One grave near the cliff edge appeared freshly disturbed, despite endless rain covering everything nearby throughout the island graveyard afterward. Elias knelt beside the mud and discovered fingernail marks clawed desperately into the soaked soil beneath the broken cross there. Before investigating further, a young monk suddenly grabbed his shoulder from behind without making any sound. The terrified monk introduced himself quietly as Brother Lucian while nervously glancing toward the monastery windows above the graveyard cliffs nearby. He warned Elias never to remain outdoors after the evening bell announced approaching high tide each night upon the island. When Elias demanded an explanation, Lucian's face filled instantly with panic and visible regret afterward. Lucian refused to say anything more and hurried back toward the monastery, through heavy fog hanging across the island silently. Elias noticed the young monk constantly touching a silver cross hanging beneath his soaked black robes while walking away quickly. Deep scratches covered Lucian's throat like something sharp had nearly torn it open previously during another terrifying encounter. As evening approached, the atmosphere inside the monastery transformed once again into silent dread beneath the rising storm outside completely. Monks rushed through corridors, carrying candles, ropes, and buckets filled with black seawater taken directly from the shore below. Elias watched them paint strange symbols across doors and windows, using dripping brushes covered in dark liquid. The abbot personally locked Elias inside his room shortly before darkness swallowed the monastery and surrounding island entirely that night. He handed Elias a wooden rosary and warned him not to answer if voices called his name after high tide. Before leaving, the abbot whispered that the sea listened carefully after sunset reached the cliffs outside. Hours later, violent knocking thundered from somewhere deep beneath the monastery foundations directly below Elias's locked room upstairs suddenly. The walls trembled while muffled screams echoed briefly through distant corridors before stopping completely again beneath the violent storm outside. Then Elias heard Brother Lucian's voice outside the door, softly begging him to let him inside immediately. The begging continued long after the knocking beneath the monastery stopped echoing through the old stone foundations below the island. Elias stared at the door handle while cold sweat rolled slowly down his neck within the darkness surrounding his room. Something about Lucian's voice sounded terribly wrong, as though seawater filled his lungs while speaking outside the hallway. The pleading became louder as scratching noises dragged slowly across the wooden surface near Elias's frightened face inside the room. Lucian repeatedly claimed the others had abandoned him somewhere beneath the chapel tunnels after sunset completely arrived that evening. Then the voice suddenly shifted into deep gurgling laughter, echoing unnaturally through the corridor outside his locked door. Terrified, Elias backed away, while clutching the wooden rosary tightly inside trembling hands. Throughout the remainder of the horrifying night alone, he remained awake until sunrise finally bled grey light through the narrow cracks surrounding the old monastery window nearby. When silence returned completely, Elias opened the door carefully and found seawater covering the hallway floor outside. Long, wet footprints stretched toward the lower monastery levels before disappearing around a staircase, descending underground beneath the structure entirely. Elias followed them secretly, while monks attended morning prayers inside the chapel high above the hidden tunnels below. The air beneath the monastery smelled ancient, moldy, and rotten like something buried beneath the ocean for centuries. The staircase led into narrow tunnels carved directly through the island's black stone foundation many centuries earlier underground there. Rusted chains hung from dripping walls, beside faded symbols painted in dried crimson stains across the narrow passageways surrounding him. Elias noticed claw marks covering nearly every surface deeper within the underground tunnels. Beneath the monastery structure below, far below the monastery, he discovered a hidden chamber illuminated by dozens of dying candles and flickering oil lamps surrounding ancient murals. The walls depicted hooded monks kneeling before a massive creature rising from violent dark waves beneath endless storms at sea. Every painted monk had their mouths sewn shut with thick black thread dripping across pale faces in terror. Elias filmed the horrifying artwork while trying desperately to ignore distant whispers echoing somewhere beyond the tunnels surrounding the chamber underground. The murals showed storms swallowing ships before faceless bodies washed ashore around the monastery, cliffs throughout countless centuries afterward there. According to faded writings beneath the paintings, the sea had delivered something alive onto the island long ago. One damaged mural revealed monks dragging a giant coffin carved from black stone into underground caverns beneath the island afterward, secretly. Strange symbols surrounded the coffin, while hooded figures stood silently beside raging floodwaters crashing through hidden tunnels below the monastery. Elias realized the monastery had never been built for worship, but instead for containment beneath the island. Further inside the chamber, Elias discovered shelves filled with ancient journals wrapped carefully in rotting cloth and heavy rope bindings. Most pages were unreadable from water damage, though several entries remained horrifyingly clear beneath flickering candlelight nearby afterward. One passage warned that speaking after high tide awakened something called the listener beneath the surrounding Black Sea. Another journal described victims hearing familiar voices calling them into flooded tunnels during the silent hours, each terrifying night afterward. The writings claimed the listener consumed voices first before eventually taking bodies into darkness beneath the cliffs surrounding the island forever. Survivors allegedly returned days later unable to speak and terrified of seawater for the remainder of their lives. Suddenly, footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the chamber entrance, while Elias examined the journals beside the candles underground beneath the monastery. He extinguished his flashlight instantly and hid behind crumbling stone pillars near the rear wall within the hidden chamber afterward. Several monks entered silently carrying ropes, lanterns, and a struggling figure bound tightly beneath black cloth coverings there. Elias watched in horror as the monks dragged the screaming prisoner toward deeper tunnels disappearing beneath the monastery foundations, completely underground. The captive begged repeatedly for mercy before one monk violently forced cloth into his mouth to silence him immediately afterward. Then the procession vanished into darkness, while something enormous moved somewhere far below the flooded caverns beneath the island. Fear battled curiosity as Elias followed the procession carefully through flooded passageways, twisting beneath the island foundations afterward silently alone. The tunnels resembled veins buried inside a rotting corpse, while ancient candles flickered strangely against dripping walls surrounding the underground labyrinth completely. Elias eventually reached a massive cavern where seawater crashed violently against jagged black rocks beneath the monastery below. Dozens of monks stood silently around the bound prisoner, while holding rusted lanterns high above the violent tide surrounding the cavern. The abbot emerged slowly carrying an ancient book wrapped carefully in chains and soaked cloth beneath flickering lantern glow there. His exhausted face appeared hollow while seawater dripped constantly from the sleeves of his black robes silently afterward. The monks forced the prisoner onto a narrow stone platform extending above crashing black water surrounding the cavern beneath the island. Elias realized with horror the captive was Brother Lucien, whose bruised throat trembled beneath the lantern light beside the platform. Tears streamed endlessly down Lucien's pale face while terrified prayers escaped through the cloth gag covering his mouth tightly. The abbot removed the gag and placed trembling hands gently against Lucien's cheeks while the cavern remained deathly silent afterward there. Then Lucien suddenly begged Elias to help him escape before the listener arrived from beneath the rising tide below them. Every monk froze instantly after hearing the words echo across the cavern walls surrounding the underground sea cave completely. A deafening knock thundered suddenly from beneath the stone platform supporting Lucien, above the violent crashing black water there underground. Another knock followed seconds later, louder and closer than before, beneath the waves surrounding the terrified monks gathered together there. Panic spread rapidly while seawater flooded across the cavern floor, around everyone standing beside the platform during the ritual. The abbot screamed silently for the monks to restore the ritual before the listener fully awakened beneath the island foundations below them. Several monks dragged Lucian toward the platform edge, while others desperately rang rusted bells throughout the flooding cavern afterward there. Then Lucian shouted that the listener was never imprisoned, because the monks had fed it willingly for centuries secretly. Before anyone stopped him, Lucian screamed the creature's true name directly into the darkness below the crashing tide beneath the cavern. Something massive exploded upward from the black seawater, with horrifying force that shattered lanterns throughout the cavern instantly around everyone gathered there. Elias glimpsed dozens of pale human mouths opening and closing across a gigantic shape rising beneath the platform afterward. The monks began screaming silently, while shadows twisted violently against the cavern walls surrounding Elias and the remaining terrified brothers there. In the chaos, Brother Lucian vanished beneath crashing black waves, without leaving even the slightest trace behind afterward completely. Then a familiar voice whispered directly beside Elias's ear, thanking Lucian for finally speaking its name aloud beneath the island. The water around the platform began bubbling violently, as though something gigantic moved directly beneath the cavern floor below everyone gathered there. Broken lanterns floated across the waves, while darkness swallowed nearly every corner of the underground chamber surrounding the monks afterward completely. Elias raised his shaking camera and captured glimpses of enormous shapes twisting beneath the black seawater there below. One terrified monk suddenly screamed despite the sacred silence and stumbled backward toward the cavern wall behind the frightened brothers nearby. Every lantern flame extinguished instantly when his voice echoed across the chamber surrounding the rising black tide beneath them all. Seconds later, invisible force dragged the monk, screaming into the water beneath the platform before anyone could save him. The abbot ordered everyone to remain silent, while several monks desperately relit candles using trembling matches beside the flooding cavern afterward. Elias watched shadows moving unnaturally between the cavern walls, while seawater climbed steadily higher around their feet. Beneath the monastery underground, somewhere below the waves, hundreds of whispering voices repeated prayers together in perfect horrifying unison throughout the darkness nearby. Finally, the abbot admitted the truth while staring hopelessly toward the flooded cavern depths surrounding the ancient underground ritual site beneath them. Centuries earlier, sailors had discovered the listener trapped beneath the island after a violent storm devastated their ship offshore completely. The creature survived by consuming voices, memories, and eventually entire human souls drawn into the darkness below the monastery. The first monks learned silence weakened the entity because spoken words allowed it to imitate human voices perfectly afterward. Underground there, every night after high tide, the monastery maintained silence to keep the listener imprisoned beneath the flooded caverns below the island. Over generations, the rituals became darker as disappearances continued, despite the sacred rules protecting everyone living there permanently. Monks began offering criminals, wanderers, and eventually their own brothers, to satisfy the creature hidden beneath the underground caverns. Afterwards, secretly, Brother Lucian had discovered the horrifying truth and threatened exposing the monastery before his capture earlier that terrible week completely. Suddenly, deep bells rang throughout the tunnels above, though nobody stood near the ropes controlling them anymore below. The cavern walls trembled violently while black seawater surged upward around the shattered platform, supporting the remaining survivors there underground completely. Elias heard hundreds of voices whispering his name from somewhere inside the crashing tide surrounding the cavern. Beneath the monastery foundations, then the listener finally emerged fully from the water, with horrifying slowness beneath the broken remains of the platform. Elias struggled to comprehend its shape, because the creature constantly shifted between shadows, tangled limbs, and human faces endlessly there underground. Mouths covered its massive body, each whispering stolen voices from countless victims consumed across centuries beneath the island monastery afterward. One mouth spoke using Brother Lucian's terrified voice, while another repeated Elias's childhood prayers, word for word nearby. The abbot ordered Elias to escape, while remaining monks prepared one final ritual to seal the caverns permanently beneath the island afterward. Several brothers chained themselves beside the flooding platform while chanting silently through trembling lips and visible tears within the darkness surrounding them. As Elias fled toward the tunnels above, the listener followed slowly behind him, using voices belonging to everyone he had ever loved. Water poured violently from cracks inside the monastery foundations, while ancient stone walls trembled round the escape tunnels surrounding Elias afterward. When he reached the monastery corridors, complete chaos had consumed the sacred halls entirely beneath the violent storm outside the island. Monks rushed silently between rooms carrying candles, ropes, and religious relics, while seawater flooded across the monastery floors everywhere. The abbot stood alone inside the chapel, surrounded by flickering candles and ancient paintings of drowned monks across the cathedral walls. He revealed the final ritual required a willing voice offered freely to imprison the listener beneath the island once again afterward. According to forbidden writings, silence weakened the creature, but sacrifice alone could force it underground, temporarily once more. Before Elias answered, horrifying knocking thundered throughout the monastery, from every direction simultaneously around the flooded chapel. Completely afterward, doors burst open while black seawater rushed through the halls like living shadows, beneath the violent storm consuming the island entirely. The listener had entered the monastery itself, and no barrier remained strong enough to stop the creature anymore. Then Brother Lucian appeared near the chapel entrance, dripping seawater beneath pale moonlight, pouring through shattered stained glass windows. Afterward there, his skin looked grey and swollen like a drowned corpse, yet his terrified eyes still appeared painfully human beneath the darkness. Lucian begged Elias not to trust the abbot, before revealing the monastery had fed innocent victims to the listener for decades. The abbot suddenly drove a black ceremonial dagger directly into Lucian's chest, before the young monk revealed anything else aloud afterward. Lucian collapsed beside the altar, while black seawater spilled unnaturally from the fatal wound across the flooded chapel floor. There, completely, the listener's monstrous shape rose behind the altar, surrounded by whispering human mouths and shifting shadows. Within the darkness afterward, Elias realized the creature no longer desired secrecy, because centuries of feeding had made it too powerful for containment anymore permanently. The listener stretched across the chapel ceiling like living darkness, while stolen faces screamed endlessly from its shifting body above everyone. Every mouth repeated Elias's name while begging him to speak the ancient sealing ritual aloud inside the collapsing monastery chapel. As the storm tore apart the monastery around them, Elias grabbed the forbidden book and shouted the ritual words anyway aloud. The listener shrieked with thousands of voices, while shadows swallowed both Elias and the creature beneath, crashing black seawater instantly afterward. When rescuers reached the island days later, the monastery stood abandoned except for whispers repeating Elias's voice beneath the tide after sunset.